During an interview, Miranda confessed to a murder in great detail and wrote on a sheet of paper claiming that this was obtained legally. But then his lawyer later stated that he was not read his rights and was unaware of his rights. And the court ruled 5-4 in favor of Miranda. The Supreme Court ruled 7-2 in favor of Roe that under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to extend a woman's decision to have an abortion, but it must abide by two legitimate interests in regulating abortions: protection, punctual life, and women's health. Johnson was arrested for burning the United States flag, but the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in his favor, stating that he was within his constitutional rights of the freedom of speech. Atkins was originally arrested and sentenced to death. Then, after an appeal, his sentence was lessened and brought to the Supreme Court. It was found unconstitutional to put a retarded person to death, as it violates the 8th Amendment under cruel and unusual punishment. After performing a premeditated murder with an accomplice, Simmons was given a death sentence, but after going to the Supreme Court in a 5-4 vote, minors under the age of 18 may not be sentenced to death via the 8th Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. Duncan was accused of a minor misdemeanor and was immediately fined and not given a trial by jury because of state law in Louisiana. He appealed to the Supreme Court and argued that he had the right to a jury trial as the Sixth Amendment states, and the court ruled 7-2 in his favor. Wisemans were opposed to a principal bringing in a local rabbi for a speech. They opposed the speech before and after the rabbi attended the school. After being denied the first time, they pursued after attending voluntarily and then brought the case to the Supreme Court, where they ruled 5-4 in favor of the Wisemans because it was unconstitutional of the school to bring the rabbi there, as it violates the Establishment Clause. Even though Miller does have the right to possess a firearm because of the Second Amendment, it is unconstitutional for him to have the weapon because it was not registered and he did not have a license for the gun because it was under 18 inches and goes against some federal regulations for guns that need to be licensed. A teenager was caught smoking in a school bathroom, and then once she was caught, a school official proceeded to check her bag, where more drug paraphernalia was found, and even though it was argued that the search was unconstitutional because of no probable cause to search the bag, the court ruled 6-3 in favor of the state and the school because there was probable cause because of her being caught smoking. Heller was a state official and was not given the right to license a firearm that he wanted to keep in his house. After being brought up to the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in favor of Heller that he had the right to possess a firearm in his home and to get it licensed because of the Second Amendment. At the school, athletes were being subjected to random drug tests that they were unaware of, and parents were very upset with this and challenged this, stating that this violated their Fourth Amendment. but when brought to the Supreme Court, it was ruled 5-4 in favor of the Board of Education. Brandsburg wrote 2 articles after witnessing the manufacturing of hashish, and then, when brought to court, refused to testify in a court case. And then, once brought to the Supreme Court, it was ruled that in a 5-4 verdict that Brandenburg was in violation and at fault of obstruction of justice. Gideon went to court and was denied his request for counsel because he couldn't afford one. The Supreme Court ruled in a 9-0 vote in favor of Gideon, saying that he should receive counsel if he is not able to afford it. Ingram refused to leave the stage after a teacher told him to. Then, afterwards, he was subjected to punishment as over 20 spanks. This was later justified in a 5-4 vote in the Supreme Court in favor of the state of Florida, justifying the actions against the child. A public voluntary prayer was written in the State Bound of Regress that mentioned God. Then, once brought to the attention of the Supreme Court, even though 2 Supreme Court justices were not part of the vote, the result consented in a 6-1 vote in favor of the students. The case Tucker v. Des Moines had a Supreme Court vote of 7-2 in favor of Tinker. The case involved kids having the right to peacefully protest during the Vietnam War. The kids wore black wristbands to represent their position. The school didn't like it. The Supreme Court agreed with the students. The case Rotary v. Rotary Club of Durante took place in 1986. The Durante chapter of the Rotary was kicked out and expelled. The Supreme Court had a 7-0 vote in favor of women because this could be identified as violating the California Civil Act against sexual discrimination. The case Mapp v. Ohio took place in 1961. The case involved criminal procedure. The Supreme Court stated that evidence obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment may not be used in state or criminal procedures. The case Bush v. Gore was involved with a dispute surrounding the 2000 elections. The Supreme Court had a 5-4 ruling with the electors from each state. Bush had votes from the electors, whereas Gore received votes from the people. Bush won the case. The case California v. Greenwood took place in 1988. The Supreme Court stated that the Fourth Amendment does not prohibit the warranties, search, siege of the garbage that is left outside. The case Escobedo v. Illinois took place in 1964. Said to do with the Supreme Court letting criminals have access to counsel during police interrogations under the Sixth Amendment. This case took place a year after Gideon v. Wainwright, which granted defendants to have the right to counsel at trial. The case Vernonia v. Acton involved the Vernonia School District, to whom believed drugs would increase injury, so they adopted a random student drug testing policy. In 1994, this was taken to the Supreme Court for ruling, and the court ruled 6-3 in favor of the school. The case New York Times v. Sullivan had a decision by the Supreme Court stating that the actual malice standard to which has to be met before pressing reports pertaining to public officials can be considered defamation and libel. The case Brown v. Board of Education took place in 1954. The Supreme Court decided that the state laws that establish separate public schools for blacks and whites to be unconstitutional. Set a ruling is not 0 in the civil rights case. Coker v. Virginia. The case Coker v. Virginia took place in 1976. The Supreme Court had a 7-2 decision stating that the death penalty was a cruel and unusual punishment for crime and rape. The case Citizens United Race Federal Elections Commission took place in 2010. The Supreme Court stated that a U.S. constitutional law case dealing with regulations granted to the campaign spending by organizations. The Supreme Court identified the First Amendment, which states that the government is prohibited from restricting social expenditures by nonprofit corporations. The case Virginia v. Loving took place in 1967. This was a landmark civil rights case involving interracial marriages. Loving won the case, but it's not like this for most states. The case Schneck v. the U.S. took place in 1919. The U.S. Supreme Court decision pertaining to the enforcement of the espionage of 1917 during World War II. The court had a 9-0 vote in favor of the U.S. because Schneck was involved in criminal activity. The Anaconda v. Oregon case took place in 1972. The Supreme Court decided that jurors may convict a defendant by less than unanimity, even though federal law requires that the federal juries must reach criminal verdicts unanimously. The U.S. v. Lopez case took place in 1995. The Supreme Court ruled that Congress has exceeded its constitutional authority under the Commerce Clause when they granted gun possession law in school areas. The court had a 5-4 ruling that the Gun-Free Zone Act was unconstitutional.